Hello and welcome to Time Out for Trade. I'm Macy Oplinski, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Amy Magnus, Director of Customs Affairs and Compliance here at Deringer. Today, she'll help us unpack how CBP balances facilitation with enforcement and what traders need to know to keep their goods compliant with changing regulations.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Magnus, and I am a director at A.N. Deringer. As we're getting ready for the Labor Day weekend, I wish I had happier news to share with you today. But I will tell you, this would probably be better at Halloween because I'm going to talk about some very scary things. I'm talking about some of the patterns that we are seeing right now in enforcement, in CBP enforcement, particularly for importing into the United States. And there is a lot going on. So I'd like to share with you some of my concerns about what is going on and maybe what an importer into the United States should be doing right now. So there are a number of laws that are available to the enforcers for importations coming into the United States. The big one is the fraud statute, 19 U.S.C. 1592. And we've done a number of webinars over the years on this particular statute, just this one. And I'm not going to go into the details of this particular law, but I would want to share with you that this includes civil fines, and they can be very large. But also, there's a criminal provision to the 19 U.S.C. 1592. And criminal, that means jail. So you don't want to run afoul of this particular law. And it's very important that you understand what your responsibilities are under this law. There's also something called the False Claims Act. And we haven't seen that used all that much in the past, but when it is used, it's very serious. Very serious. And it has been a useful tool for for the enforcers. I'll explain that a little bit further on. There are things called liquidated damages. And if you have a bond, and importers who import commercial goods into the United States have to have a bond in order to import, these liquidated damages can go against that bond amount. So if you have a bond, let's say in the amount of $100,000, you can be assessed liquidated damages for a variety of violations. Not all types of violations fall under the bond, but for a variety. And the penalties or the liquidated damages cap out at the bond amount. So a $100,000 bond, the liquidated damages can only go as high as $100,000. However, there have been many requirements lately to increase bond amounts. So a $100,000 bond is kind of a small dollar amount now compared to what they are. And a lot of the increase in bond amounts is, of course, due to the incredible increase in duties. There are things called rate advances where the CBP officials may determine that some duty should have been paid and wasn't paid, and they can simply rate advance the entry and charge additional duties. Those duties, of course, if you don't pay them, will go against your bond, and there will be liquidated damages for the unpaid duties. Then there's something called a withhold release order. Now, that is generally being used for forced labor. Forced labor is if there is any type of forced labor in the supply chain and customs suspects that it exists, they will withhold the release of the cargo until the importer can satisfy them, CBP, that there is no forced labor in the supply chain. So that's been used in the past, and I suspect it's going to continue being used for certain types of imports where CBP suspects that there is forced labor or has some intelligence that there is some forced labor in the supply chain. And then, of course, the government can also simply suspend your ability to import if they find too many violations or you have unpaid duties or unpaid fines. So really, these are some pretty strong enforcement tools that are available. What I really feel is current right now that everyone should be aware of. Of course, there's always been this enforcement in the past, so there's really nothing new in terms of the enforcement. What is new, and what I wanted to describe to our customers in particular, because we really do care about you and we don't want you to get in trouble at all. There is new energy, and there are also new resources being deployed to focus on avoidance of the tariffs. So, how can you avoid tariff? What kind of illegal schemes could you be engaged in to be avoiding these new tariffs? And these new tariffs are pretty high. We're talking about the IEEPA fentanyl tariffs against China and Mexico and Canada, and then the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs against all manner of countries around the world. Depending on what country will depend on what rate of reciprocal tariff you will be subject to. So these are two fairly recent duties, really. And then we have the 232 duties that are now being assessed against steel, aluminum, and copper, or goods that have steel, aluminum, or copper content. These are huge duties, 50%. So, and could be more if it's country of origin, Russia, and it's aluminum, could be 200%. So we're talking a lot of duty here. So people want to avoid having to pay these duties, and some people are doing this through illegal schemes. One of them is false valuation. They undervalue the goods so that they can pay less duty. The other one is that they fake the harmonized tariff number, and it doesn't really reflect the actual good. And that could be because another tariff has a lower duty rate. For instance, if the item is made of steel or has steel content, those duties are pretty high. Somebody may use a tariff number that is not subject to aluminum, steel, or copper 232 duties. False country of origin claims. If the goods come from a country of origin that has a high duty rate, particularly, let's say, a high reciprocal rate, or in the case of, let's say, the Russian aluminum, you might want to falsify that country of origin. Of course, you could falsify your free trade agreement, and we're particularly concerned about the USMCA or the old NAFTA. You know, if the goods qualify, great, but if they don't qualify, and you make a claim for this free trade agreement, you could find yourself on the other side of this this terrible situation of fines, penalties, and worse. Failure to report goods duties that are subject to anti-dumping and countervailing duty. These anti-dumping and countervailing duty have been around a long time, but what we have seen is an increase in the number of cases, which means there's an increase in the number of goods that are subject to anti-dumping and countervailing duty. So this is another way that you could perhaps falsify something in order to avoid these duties. If you claim goods are, let's say, subject to Chapter 98, for example, you might claim that they're U.S. origin goods when in fact they are not. And of course, bringing in goods that are subject to false labor and somehow lying about it. Those are the things that Customs is looking for right now. Those are the types of violations. And they're getting better and better at uncovering these violations. So let's talk about 19 U.S.C. 1592, which is the fraud statute. As I said, we've gone through a lot of the details around 1592 in the past, and I don't want to belabor that right now, other than just to share with you the parties that can be subject to a fraud statute. Of course, the importer of record is always liable under this statute and others, but so too could U.S. purchasers or importers of goods. Even when they're not acting as importer of record, they could be cited under this statute. Corporate officers and employees who influence customs declarations, they could be penalized. Brokers and forwarders, like myself, we could be penalized if we are caught facilitating in an illegal importation. And of course, we are not going to do that. Anyone in the company, any company that causes or directs or facilitates the submission of false or incomplete information could be subject to 1592. And just to scare you even more, there is what we call a latent liability. Customs can go back 5 years. So you do not want to be caught in this net. I can just tell you that. And also, I want to just point out something. We threw this word around a couple of days ago, and I wanted to remind people that there is such a thing as conscious avoidance or willful blindness or willful ignorance. In other words, you don't get a free pass because you didn't know. You have to know. If you are going to import into the United States, you have to be aware of what you're doing, aware of where the goods are coming from, and aware of the duties that are required, the duty or the tariffs that are required to be paid on those goods. There's something called the Enforce and Protect Act. That really pertains to the anti-dumping and countervailing duties. But I did put a link to a website if you do get a copy of this presentation. And if you don't, you can just Google EAPA, Enforce and Protect Act, and it'll take you to cbp.gov. And you can see where some of the investigations are going on for a avoidance of anti-dumping or countervailing duty, or companies that may be subject in the future to anti-dumping and countervailing duties because there are ongoing investigations of dumping or countervailing duty. So it's a good resource just to check every now and then to see if you are importing goods that might possibly be subject to one of these cases. Because as I said, anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases have expanded quite a bit in the last couple of years. There's also the involvement of the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. They are getting a little bit more active in customs type fraud and duty avoidance. There is a market integrity and major fraud unit that resides within the Department of Justice. And that seems to be getting a little bit more beefed up, if you will. They've been given additional resources and direction to start to target tariff evasion. So tariff evasion are all the things that I just talked about, all the different ways that people might be struggling to try to lower their tariff liability illegally. And that, of course, eventually can come back to bite you. So the Criminal Division's specialized unit develops all manners of fraud cases. They usually focus on the really big cases, but we're just seeing, and by the way, they specialize in a lot of fraud cases, not just tariff or customs issues, all kinds of other things. But they seem to be looking more closely right now at tariff evasion because of all these new tariffs and all the big dollar amount that might be subject to certain evasion schemes. So the Department of Justice also announced that it is going to leverage the False Claims Act. And the False Claims Act has been a very productive place for law enforcement officers because generally it does involve a whistleblower. And the whistleblower may point the finger at somebody or some company, and they will actually get paid. The whistleblower will get paid if the case does ripen into fines and findings. And so there is some incentive there for people to become whistleblowers. So you do, it's almost like don't try to do anything to avoid these tariffs because or don't do anything illegal to avoid these tariffs because it seems like they're going to come at you every which way. Because it isn't just CBP who's doing this enforcement. It is the Department of Justice now and Homeland Security. And because the tariffs are so high, the fines and penalties for avoiding them will also be high. So this is just a little bit about the False Claims Act. If anybody is interested in learning more, as I said, it's used for all manner of violations, healthcare fraud, cybersecurity, pandemic relief fraud, all kinds of fraud. But I highlighted tariff and customs avoidance because that tariff and customs duties avoidance, because that is, as I said, becoming a focus of the Department of Justice. because there is such a focus, I'm just encouraging everybody, please don't play games with this. Please stay above board, know what you're doing, keep documentation, support the claims that you're making if you're using any type of free trade agreement or any other type of legal means to reduce your duty exposure. And there are many legal means to do that. Just make sure that you keep the documentation to support it. And I'm talking about things like your bills of lading, your production records, invoices for the materials that were used in the production of the goods, all types of accounting documentation to support and substantiate the reported values. Because if customs comes knocking, or worse, if the Department of Justice comes knocking, you want to be able to prove that no, these are legitimate claims, and here I can prove how much I paid, and here's the invoice, and here's the record keeping that proves all of this. And I can tell you that if insufficient documentation is provided to substantiate the values, customs will collect duty on steel or aluminum or copper based on the entire value of the good. Just as an example, if you can't substantiate the fact that, oh, wait a minute, there was only, $25 worth of steel in this couch, be very careful. Be able to substantiate those values. Importers who submit underreported declarations will, I'm not saying maybe, you will be subject to severe consequences. And as we went over before, significant monetary penalties, loss of import privileges, and criminal liability. So, want to quickly touch on transship. Don't transship. We used to think transship meant an illegal transshipment. We used to think that meant goods country of origin China, shipped to Vietnam, from Vietnam shipped to the United States, claiming country of origin Vietnam, when in fact the goods were really country of origin China. The definition of transshipment is starting to change. We don't know how that's going to actually look, but we suspect that if you have a product or a good that has quite a bit of input, let's say from a country like China, and has some input from Vietnam, but let's just say it hasn't been transformed in Vietnam, that it really, when you look at it, the majority of the input is from China. That might actually come under a new definition of transshipment. We don't know yet what that is going to look like. Just beware of where the inputs are that create the product that you are importing. Make sure that you can trace goods deep into the supply chain as we find out more and more how CBP in the government is going to newly define what we used to call transshipment. I don't want to move too far away from forced labor concerns because there still is forced labor concerns, and that's where these withhold release orders come in. So once again, I'm giving you another reason to know where your goods are sourced deep into the supply chain. So if you have inputs from countries or from companies that may be subject to forced labor or may be guilty of forced labor, you want to take a look at all of that and know where the goods are coming from and know where the inputs for the goods are coming from, not just for forced labor concerns in addition to forced labor concerns, but also future concerns about duty. You have to know where the steel or the copper is actually smelted, poured, or melted and cast. You need to know where those metals are actually created. So there's more and more reasons to know where goods are coming from. So know where goods are coming from. Document. Ensure you maintain all documentation to justify your country of origin, your classification, your value. All of this needs to be documented. If you have any doubts about anything, you can always get a binding ruling. You should get the advice of the trade expert. You should always be aware of what I call the willful blindness. If you don't know and you don't ask, you are going to perhaps you may fall into a very bad trap. Reminder that there is latent liability. Customs can go back 5 years if they find violations. So don't go it alone. Ask for help if you have any doubts at all. And what can you do? You can have a strong compliance program, a strong in-house compliance program if you're importing. The other thing that you can do, and this is starting to really emerge, there are some great data analytics tools. And I want to tell you that CBP is using them. CBP is getting a whole lot better at targeting. But you can use some analytics also. Download your ACE data, work with your broker, do some analytics on your data to see if you can find any anomalies. Look yourself for violations before customs does. You can look internally, or you can have an expert help you with this, or you can use some really new sophisticated tools to run through your supply chain to see if there are any red flags. You should have a program in-house for whistleblowers so that they come to in-house before they go out-house to blow the whistle. Review all your filings that are made on your behalf. We at Deringer try to be the best broker you could possibly have, but we are not perfect. And these things are so complex now than much more than they used to be. And CBP's systems don't have the edits that we could rely on. So we're doing our best to make sure that your filings are true and correct and that we help you. But please partner with us and review the work to make sure that everything that's being transmitted is true and correct. And with that, I'm going to end it, and I hope I've helped you a little bit. I know this should have been more at Halloween and Labor Day, but you know what? If you're doing it right, you don't have any worries. Just make sure you're doing it right. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Time Out for Trade. Huge thanks to Amy for coming on to help us better understand the enforcement landscape in 2025. If you found this conversation helpful, be sure to visit us at anderinger.com for more resources, insights, and market updates. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn, X, and Facebook to stay in the loop. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.